Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Islamic Thought Podcast, episode 5. Today, I am your host, Atsiz, along with my co-host, Yahya. How are you doing today, Yahya?
So, alhamdulillah, can't complain.
Alhamdulillah. And today we have a very special guest with us today, which is Zohair Abdul Rahman. How are you doing, Zohair?
Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair for having me. Excited to be here.
Jazakallah khair. So today the topic will be the human fitrah, the natural disposition of a human being, some of the discussions that are required to actually understand what the fitrah is, some of the notions that are passed today within our contemporary times, both within an academic light and also within a spiritual light, and the need for Muslims to sort of try and grasp or understand actually where does this leave us in terms of the Islamic scope that we have in terms of beliefs and so on. So before we actually get into the discussion, Yahya, do you want to give a good brief introduction to Brother Zohair?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, I've known Brother Zohair for quite a bit now. I knew him from my university days, very active, mashallah, and helped out the MSA in that field. And most people who are listening to this probably know him from his writings for Yaqeen Institute. He has a background in life sciences, and he has also a background in psychology, and also obviously Islamic studies within Aqidah and Hadith and so on. So inshallah, I don't want to break his back, but it should be very beneficial.
Inshallah. And just to add to that, there is quite a few good articles that we would definitely recommend. And what we will do is we'll actually include all of the links to both Spiritual Perception and both to Yaqeen Institute in the link description below. So you guys can do sort of further reading on this. And if you have any questions or interactions that you would like, you're more than welcome to join the server and ask the questions and interact directly. So getting straight to it, Yahya, how do we even start this conversation? How do we even actually get into the discussion? Because fitrah tends to be a very, very big topic.
I think the beginning should be building off of our last episode on worldviews.
Yeah.
And coming to a worldview is, at the end of the day, we need to come to know how we know stuff. So I think it's appropriate to talk about what epistemology is, as it's a word that's generally thrown out and not a lot of people know what it means. And it's very pertinent to understanding the rest of this discussion. So, Brother Zohair, do you want to explain to the people what epistemology means?
So, epistemology, well, first of all, I'd like to start off by thanking you guys again for bringing me here. And I think that this is a very important topic for the reasons you guys have mentioned. But also as well, it's very important because we're going to show, inshallah ta'ala, through this podcast, why the fitrah is the number one tool, or the most powerful tool at our disposal to dismantling the doubts and the shubuhat that affect many young Muslims going through issues of crises of faith, and even issues of shahawat as well, issues of desires and changing morality and norms and things like that. So the fitrah is a very powerful concept. So in terms of what is epistemology, the fitrah kind of falls within this, Western term of epistemology, the study of epistemology. Epistemology is, in short, the study of knowledge. It's the study of how does a person know something is true or false. How does a person come to any type of knowledge? So there's epistemology can refer to so many different categories. So you can have epistemology related to medicine. So how do we know what is a cure for a disease versus what is is bad for a disease? What is a disease itself? How do we come to know these different things? And the answer to that, the epistemology of medicine, at least modern medicine, is the scientific pursuit, engaging in empirical investigations, experimentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also, interestingly, by the way, about the epistemology of medicine, Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah actually goes in detail about issues of epistemology in medicine and in astronomy, because in his times there were a lot of prevailing attitudes regarding astrology in regards to the science of the stars, where people were saying things like the position of the stars determine certain events in the world and its effect on destiny, et cetera, et cetera. And he advocated for a kind of objective, unbiased, empirical stance towards astronomy, and essentially discarded with astrology, calling it pseudoscience. And he does this in Miftah Dar al-Sa'ada, the keys of happiness. In this work is a large work, a couple of volumes, and it essentially goes over his philosophy of science and the importance of having a firm epistemology when it comes to the natural world. And he also talks about medicine as well in Zad al-Ma'ad. He talks about the issue of medicine and whether or not people should blindly follow Greek tradition regarding medicine and taking it over revelation and like the prophetic inscriptions versus tajriba, versus proper experimentation and tashrih. And literally tashrih is like dissections and actually going through and understanding the anatomy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In any case, so it's a very interesting point that epistemology was something that was a concern to Muslim scholars, not just related to issues of God and theology in the world of the unseen, but also in regards to the issues of the natural world. Because if you don't have a proper epistemology when it comes to the natural world, you will inevitably be invoking issues of falsehood to try to understand certain things. And that was seen to classical Islamic scholars as actually a blasphemy against God, because if you say, for instance, in a pseudoscientific way about, oh, the stars are arranged in a particular way and are affecting something on this world, you're actually giving power to the stars in the sky, which is not due to them, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give to them. And so that's actually a divine right that you are taking away and giving it to the creation, which is the essence of shirk. And same thing goes with issues of medicine. If you're giving these special powers to natural forces where there is no actual legitimate cause and effect relationship, then you're actually giving that entity, that natural entity, a power and an agency that it's not due. And this could either be just an honest mistake, or it could delve into this issue of giving them these supernatural powers. In any case, moving forward from that. So essentially, epistemology is, how do you know about something? And so in relating to, I guess, what we're going to be focusing on, which is issues of theology, we're going to be focusing on, well, how do you know about God? How do you know about the world unseen? How do you know about the existence of truth and all these different issues? And so that's the idea of epistemologists, getting to that root of, okay, you can have a discussion about the existence of God, but the question is, do the two people who are having this discussion have a same epistemology? Do they have a same approach to getting the answer to that question? If they don't have the same approach, then you're just going to be butting heads, and people are going to get nowhere. And there was actually an interesting demonstration of this issue of kind of competing epistemologies. There was recently an interview with Donald Trump. I just saw it today or yesterday, where he was talking with one of the reporters from CNN about his call for the national state of emergency and whether or not it was justified. And this was very interesting because it played on the issue of epistemology. So the reporter was citing certain statistics and saying that actually statistically, native-born Americans are more likely to commit crime than illegal immigrants. And then it was interesting because Trump then said, do you really believe those statistics? And he's like, just look outside and look at the prisons and you can see X, Y, Z. And so this was about competing epistemologies. The question was, well, is it dangerous, the fact that illegal immigrants are in America, and is it producing this threat that's beyond normal? And the epistemology of the reporter of the CNN was, okay, let's look at statistical analyses. And for Trump, it was more, no, let's forget the statistics. Let's distrust that process for whatever reason. Let's just focus on your own lived experience. When you go outside, when you see, the prisons or whatever, or wherever, however he sees them, what do you think? And it wasn't really based on an empirical thing. It was more based on a hunch. He was really appealing towards this intuitive kind of idea, that stereotype really that a person has about illegal immigrants and the salience that crimes occur, that crimes are perpetrated by them, the salience at which that manifests in people's minds. He was appealing to that aspect. So it's the idea of competing epistemologies that played out there. And so that's why it's relevant as well regarding belief in existence of God and whatnot, because a lot of people can have competing epistemologies, and that's why people don't come to a knowledge of God, because they might have an epistemology that is set up to fail.
When it comes to the modern age and the topic of epistemology, for the average Muslim, that doesn't really have a deep understanding or a deep sort of interaction with the Islamic sciences and ilm, and actually knowing why epistemology is even important in this modern era. For him, when he's practicing his Islam and he has his beliefs on a day-to-day basis, there are going to be certain aspects of the Islamic sciences that are going to impact him. So when it comes to the interaction between seeing knowledge and then seeing what is actually the process to actually verify such knowledge, how does these two aspects actually impact the average Muslim who doesn't really have, much academic capabilities per se? How does it even impact him to begin with?
That's a very good question about, what's the thamar, I guess you can say, the fruit of studying this area for the average Muslim. I think that when you describe the idea of, okay, there's a difference between knowledge and then there's how do you get to that knowledge, or the usul, or the principles to, attaining that knowledge. I think that for the average Muslim, it might not be necessary to discuss, epistemology, because, and we're going to come into this, actually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within us a natural epistemology that does not need to be articulated. If a person is not exposed to all these different questions and doubts, a lot of times it just functions normally, and it's something that is not required to be studied, because it's just lived. It's common sense for people. You talk to a lot of people, especially people from the older generation, and you ask them, why do you believe in God or whatnot? It's a question that the doubt of his existence didn't even occur to them. It's not even an issue that needs to be discussed for them. They have this kind of knowledge that comes to them, and it's an automatic process that's coming from a pure fitrah. So for an average Muslim who's not bothered by these questions, I don't think that this is important to teach them as a very important first step, for instance. Definitely, if a person's interested in kind of speaking and dialoguing with other people, then I think that this is an important area to study. But for instance, going back to the example of medicine, your body works perfectly fine. The average person doesn't need to know about how the heart works. The heart will pump its blood, whether you know it or not. The same thing with the fitrah. Whether you know it or not, it will operate in your mind. Yes, it can be, disease. It can be corrupted, just like the heart. And in which case, then it's about going to, for the average person, it's about going to, learning more about it and understanding its processes and what harms it, what doesn't harm it, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's working fine and there's no issues, then I don't think it's something that really requires in-depth study. But if there's a person that's encountering doubt and there's issues there, a sign of kind of a perturbed fitrah, then that's something that I think is very important for them to understand and recognize the significance of the fitrah and what exactly it is.
So I think that goes into our next segment, maybe the absolute question of this podcast. What exactly is the fitrah?
Yeah, so I mean, the fitrah is a term that's used in the Quran. In Surah Al-Rum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nasa alayha. The fitrah, which comes from fatara, which is the concept of origination, the concept of creation. And Allah describes it as His fitrah. It's the way in which Allah created people. And so when you look at kind of the tafasir and the way that the fitrah is understood, people look at the fitrah different ways. People talk about fitrah from a physical way, the physical fitrah, the kind of physical behaviors that people kind of engage in that's quote unquote from the fitrah. Excuse me. Things like trimming the nails and, trimming the armpit hairs and whatnot. These things are described as from the fitrah. But there's also that kind of spiritual, psychological aspect of the fitrah. So it's hard to find a proper English translation for it, but I think, terms such as kind of the natural predisposition, the inbuilt constitution, the kind of the default factory setting, on which human beings have been set. That's kind of the idea there. So the fitrah represents a person's natural way of perceiving the world, their natural way of looking at the world. That's really, in essence, what the fitrah is. So that's kind of a short answer to the question. Obviously, we can go on and on and on about, okay, well, what that does entail. I will mention some important points about the fitrah. So a lot of times when people talk about the fitrah, they kind of put it in juxtaposition of the aql, of the intellect. And, they kind of say, okay, is this something that's based? So they talk about, for instance, the existence of God. And when someone says, for instance, oh, that's known by the fitrah, there's this concept, there's this idea that, oh, that means that, it's not a logical thing. It can't be, quote unquote, logically proven. I think it's more, whether that statement's true or not, it's a bit more complicated than that. Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, who was a scholar who passed away in the 8th century of Islam, he was a theologian, and I mean, controversial from his time, really until our times. But no one really can deny his contribution to the field of what you can call, if you want, Islamic epistemology. He was very much concerned with the idea of how do we come to know things about Allah, know who He is, know His revelation, and obviously as well know His existence. So in his works, he describes the fitrah, and he talks about the difference between the aql and the fitrah. And he actually says, in the fitrah, fihi ma'rifatul aql. Like in the fitrah is the recognition of the aql. Like you can't separate them, because what we said, the natural way of human beings perceiving the world. And this goes back into a bit of cognitive psychology. When we perceive the world, people think like it's like a mirror, like in our brain, right? Like it's just something that we just reflect what's actually out there. Actually, what we know is that the human brain engages in so much processing of the stimuli that comes to it. The visual, auditory stimuli, the tactile stimuli, the olfactory stimuli, all the stimuli that comes to it. The human brain doesn't just reflect that into your mind or into your occipital lobe. There's processing that occurs at so many different areas of your brain. And this processing takes that stimuli, which is really just light at the end of the day, undifferentiated light that's coming to your retina. It takes that and it interprets it. Every single brain is interpreting it and processing it. And so, for instance, when you look outside, when you're looking at your desk, for instance, wherever you are right now, and you look wherever you are, you're probably going to see mobile device, table, chair, roads, trees. Those things occur to your mind almost instantaneously. Those categorizations of this is a table, which is a separate object than the laptop that's on top of it. That's processing that occurs in the mind. Because at the end of the day, why did you make how did you decide that they were two separate objects? How did you come to know that? It's just natural. It's the way that you naturally perceive it, because human beings are naturally designed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be able to perceive different objects, even if they are connected with one another.
One thing to really add to that would be this issue of morality. Because today, especially living in secular times, the question of morality becomes very, very important for every single individual. So then the question becomes is that the way in which we can categorize the aql, or the intellect, and view it through the scope of the fitrah, can the same actually be said for morality? Even though we're taking a step back here, stepping back from the framework of religious morality, and actually seeing that, does the fitrah encompass any level of morality? Because I know that Ibn Taymiyyah, he was of the opinion that actually even justice within itself is from the fitrah. So I mean, from a psychological perspective, and both from a epistemological perspective, where does the morality fit into it, if it does at all?
Very good question. So just kind of tidying up what my last point, and it kind of goes perfectly into this question. So the idea is that human beings engage in this natural processing in their brain, and when stimuli come to them, they naturally categorize them into different things, whether that's objects, whether that's cause and effect relationships, whether it's all these things, these are naturally inborn into our minds. They're not something that requires to be taught. We naturally kind of come to this. And that's why if you look in the field of developmental psychology, they go into a lot about how a child kind of learns about the world without really being taught. They're just this natural instinct that comes regarding language. So grammar, it's shown as well that, syntax is something that it comes almost biologically to a child, that a child kind of gets the concept of grammar rules at a very young age before he's formally taught. In any case, moving forward, so like we said, fitrah is really the natural way that a person looks at the world. And so we can look at the world from an intellectual perspective in terms of kind of rational principles. So logic and rational principles, the idea that, the whole is greater than, its parts. The idea that a thing cannot be, dead and alive at the same time. These types of kind of rational absurdities naturally come to us as something that doesn't make sense. So that's kind of the natural way that we see the world. We're not taught that. It's just the way that our human mind views the world and perceives world and reality. Now, when it comes to moral categorization, it extends to moral categorizations of good and bad as well. So when we look outside and we look at the world and we see things, we look at it from an intellectual perspective, from a physical perspective. We kind of see and categorize and interpret things as cause and effect, as kind of object, as separate objects, as categorizations. This is a tree; it's part of the family of trees, et cetera, et cetera. All these different things were just coming to us instinctually. Also, the categorization of human behavior as good and bad is something that's also instinctual as well. And there's a lot of work done in this in developmental psychology as well. There's two works that I would recommend. There's one, Born Believers, and there's another one on called Just Babies. The Born Believers is by Justin Barrett. The second one is Born Believers. I forgot the name of the author. But those are two very good books that explore a lot of different child psychology studies at the level of infant, like literally 8 months to 12 months to toddlers. And they explore their beliefs and the way that they see the world, the way that they naturally see the world, which is really getting in tune with that concept of what is that fitrah? What is the natural way that human beings perceive the world? So the perception of the world comes under moral lens. There's a moral lens in our mind, wherever it is. There's a moral lens by which we categorize human behavior. There's a rational lens by which we make sense of the world around us and understand what's an absurdity, what's a possibility, what's an impossibility. And there's that kind of, I guess, a empirical lens as well, as we kind of look for patterns in nature and see how things are naturally connected and relate to one another. So kind of that's in the nutshell the fitrah in that sense. The fitrah is a kind of a holistic, comprehensive set of lenses, you can say, by which a human being sees the world naturally. And so the significance of this is that I think we'll cut this. I think we will tackle this, inshallah ta'ala, as at the course of this conversation. So I'll leave it at that for now.
So Zohair, one thing that, especially nowadays, as more and more people are engaging, like there's a massive Islamic information coming out of it. And the concept of rationality, right? That you need to rationally prove things, that systemized logic is getting more widespread within the Muslim community and more widespread amongst people who are becoming more literate in the Islamic sciences. So how would the traditional understanding of logic fit in with our understanding of the fitrah?
Very good question. Yeah. So I would take us way back to the beginning at this point. You can really find in the Western stream of thought, from its inception, if you want to call it its inception, but rather from its roots in Greek Hellenistic Greek philosophy in the Hellenistic period, you find that Western civilization has kind of followed the tradition of the Greeks. And the Greeks introduced this very skeptic-oriented epistemology, you can say, of being skeptical at everything and focusing on logic as the primary, or they all differed. Some was logic, some was empiricism, Some were just completely Pyrrhonian skeptics who just kind of doubted everything, even their empirical senses and their logic, and so they were kind of left with this view of doubting whether or not they exist or whatever is around them exists, or whether they're in a matrix or whatnot, and whether they're still dreaming or whether they're still dreaming or they're awake. All these different things. So, kind of coming from that, the West carries this legacy of kind of this extreme skepticism and this critical attitude, which is actually a very good thing when it comes to issues of the world. As we've seen, Western civilization has been able to flourish as it has. And a lot of that, people kind of owe that to the scrutiny of the scientific method and whatnot. There's actually an interesting hadith as well, narration, where the Prophet ﷺ praises the Romans. And, from that, we would really say Western civilization for some qualities that they have that makes them successful. And one of them is this kind of critical attitude that they have towards themselves and the accountability that they have towards their leaders in government. In any case, that's a whole another discussion. The point is that this kind of epistemology that the West has inherited is extremely skeptical. And what had happened was that because it was so skeptical and challenged, the most basic notions of truth and falsehood and logic and reasoning and whatnot, it completely destroyed any kind of real taking Christianity, seriously. Any real kind of belief in God or whatnot. And so this logic, this kind of overemphasis on logic to come to truth, which is something we're all taught when we, as young as, elementary school onwards, the epistemology of the West, this idea of question everything, this idea of, if it's not logical or you can't see it, then it's, then it's doubtful, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of an unnatural way of seeing the world. It's not in line with the fitrah. Human beings don't, naturally, as they go on their day-to-day, actually make sure that they have a syllogistic argument with two premises and a conclusion, and make sure that they're cogent when they come to decisions about things. That's not the process that they engage in. They come to know about things through other processes, through intuition, through moral reasoning, which is different from logical reasoning. How does a person just come to know that's not fair or whatnot, or that's unjust? It's not through any logical process. So the problem obviously is that logic is kind of given this status, and beyond logic as well. Really, what went beyond logic was the empiricism. Because, after kind of the philosophers couldn't really get much traction, you couldn't really do anything because all they were doing was really just doubting everything. Then you have the scientific revolution, and now you have this focus on empiricism, this idea of, okay, forget logic or whatever. It's all about what you can see, what you can predict of the data, what are the things that you can prove in a laboratory, all those different things. So that kind of shift happened in the last couple of centuries, and the focus has been a lot on empiricism. So there's kind of these two different schools, like the philosopher rationalists or the scientific empiricists. And so neither of these camps, but from both of these camps, there's really no serious conception of God, no serious conception of God that actually would have a impact on a person's life. But what has happened is that Muslims who have grown up in the West, who have kind of learned these kind of ways of scrutinizing, information and whatnot, they've attempted to use these different approaches to prove God's existence and to show, no, it's not absurd to believe in God, even if you look at it from a purely logical perspective, or if you look at it from an empirical perspective. And so in doing so, many Muslims have failed in trying to, convince themselves, other Muslims, non-Muslims, that, God is true based upon these different approaches. You have, for instance, in regards from a logical perspective, people talk about the Kalam cosmological argument. It's hundreds years of centuries old argument that finds its roots actually in millennia in Aristotle's argument for God's existence. it's something that's been debated, throughout time up until now. And it doesn't really, and actually Ibn Taymiyyah himself criticized this argument and says this is just brings about doubt. It doesn't bring about certain knowledge about God's existence. And on the other side, you have, empirical kind of ways where people talk about ideas of, intelligent design. And Christian evangelicals and Catholics are really behind this intelligent design movement and trying to prove God by showing different aspects of science, and showing that science proves God's existence by this anthropic principle, or this idea that the universe is fine-tuned for living, and they show different aspects to show that, hey, this has to be intelligent design, et cetera, et cetera. Now, from both perspectives, what they're saying is true, obviously. No one's going to dispute that yes, the Kalam cosmological argument argues that this universe was created, it had a beginning, and so Allah created the universe. We would agree with that. The intelligent design people, when they talk about how everything's beautifully fine-tuned, the Quran mentions this. I mean, no one's disputing these aspects. What we're disputing is whether or not this can be used to convince a skeptic. Whether or not this can be used to convince a skeptic. It can definitely be used to increase the iman of a believer. It could even be used to convince a person with a proper fitrah, and we're going to go to that. Someone who's not trying to, learn about God through this kind of pigeonholed epistemology of just logic or just kind of empirical investigation. But for those people who are, stuck in that pigeonhole, then for them, this is not going to convince them. And Muslims who are still stuck in that way of looking at the world, they'll find themselves never able to find a cure for their doubt, because there's really no way out of doubt if a person approaches it from the rationalistic or empiricist mindset. And the reason for that is quite simple. There's an interesting philosophical conundrum called Munchausen's trilemma. And Munchausen's was an interesting figure in history. Not Allah Alam if he really existed, but he was this person known for telling tall tales. Actually, in medicine, there's a syndrome called Munchausen syndrome, and it's labeled to patients who basically make up their disorder, and they come to the hospital looking for basically just attention and whatnot, and they just make things up about what they have. But there's also relevance in philosophy, because Munchausen's trilemma is the idea that when it comes to anything that a person knows, that there's a trilemma, in the sense that either that person knows that thing because of a logical argument, for instance. But the problem is that this justification for that knowledge will go into one of three ways, which are all untenable. Number one is, it will go to an infinite regress. So, for instance, a person says, this is a logical argument for A. And then a person will ask, well, what's the logical argument for that logical argument? Well, what's the logical argument for that logical argument? Until it gets to the point, well, that's just logic. That's how it works. Then you have to ask the question, well, what's the logical argument that we should trust our logic? And it goes on into infinity. And so then that's one line. The other line is, so that's infinitism. The other line is foundationalism, where you take it to a foundation like rationalism or empiricism, and you just say, that's it, full stop. We just trust our logic, and that's just the way it is. Or if you don't do it that way, or it goes into kind of a circular reasoning, which is this idea of, either it goes to, X proves Y, and what proves X? Well, Y proves X. So Y proves X and X proves Y. So it's this kind of circular reasoning. And so in any case, the reason why I'm saying this is because it demonstrates the idea that if a person has this limited epistemology, they actually can't know anything, because they cannot escape Munchausen's trilemma. Everything is going to be called to question and doubted. Reason itself can be doubted. If a person says, I'll only believe something that has a logical argument, well, you just have to ask, well, what's the logical argument for that statement you just made? I will only believe in something that has a logical argument. What's the logical argument to say logic brings about truth? What's the logical argument for that? There is none. It can't exist outside itself. That's just going to be circular reasoning. Same thing with empiricism as well. oh, when I see it, it's true. Well, what's the empirical proof that what you see is true? There is none. You can't prove it. And so this is the reason why this approach of Western skepticism is futile. And the Quran references this concept. I mean, it's not just Western in origin. The skeptic mindset is really culturally, the West has taken it on as its culture. But skepticism is something that exists throughout all civilizations and cultures on the individual level. And the Quran, you can say, so a lot of people say, for instance, oh, the Quran doesn't really address atheists. And I would say by and large it's true in the sense that the Quran is not addressed to the belief of, there's, the Quran is not clearly not interested in proving God's existence to someone who doubts God's existence. But definitely the Quran is addressed primarily to the skeptic attitude, to the person that's just constantly skeptical. And that's why you find constantly terms like shak, raib, both of them essentially meaning doubt and skepticism, dhann, conjecture. It's addressing an attitude of skepticism. Underlying that skepticism is a bunch of kind of moral and psychological issues that brings forth the skepticism. That's another thing. A lot of people think, oh, when we talk about the existence of God or whatnot, this is purely philosophical enterprise. No, it's not. It includes so many different factors: a person's moral character, a person's spirituality. It all comes together to produce a person's set of beliefs. Inshallah, maybe we can explore that later. But my point from saying this is that when it comes to the Quran's kind of main focus towards the skeptic, the Quran constantly says, when the skeptic asks, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, show us a sign, constantly, or other prophets, even the Bani Israel, they were not God skeptics, they were revelation skeptics. Anytime a prophet came, they'd say, oh, prove to me that you're really from God, right? They're revelation skeptics. And the Quran beautifully and succinctly explains the problem with the skeptic attitude, and the reason why nothing will ever satisfy the skeptic attitude. Because there's this idea of, well, if Islam is true, then its truth should be known to everyone. Everyone should be able to understand it. But the Quran explains, no, there are certain people that because their epistemology is such, they'll never actually come to belief, and they'll never come to faith, no matter if you warn them or if you don't warn them. Am lam tundirhum la yu'minun. They won't believe. And so the Quran, for instance, says, they ask you for a sign. Say that if we were to give them a sign and opened up the heavens, and they were ascending to heaven, and they were seeing all of that, what would they say? لَقَالُوا بَلْ سُكِّرَتْ أَبْصَارُنَا بَلْ نَحْنُ قَوْمٌ مَسْحُورُونَ. No, we're hallucinating. This is not happening. This is just a hallucination of our eyes, and we're just bewitched. We just some magic's been done to us. So you see that even the strongest sign that they themselves are saying, okay, once I get the sign, then I'll believe. The Quran explains, no, you won't believe, because you can always be skeptical about anything if you want to. And even the most clearest sign, you can easily dismiss it by saying, oh, I'm just hallucinating. How do I know that I'm actually seeing it? How do I know that it's not something else that's going on? How do I know? I mean, they invoked the term of sorcery or whatnot. In our times, people wouldn't say that. The skeptic wouldn't say that. They'd say things like, "Oh, you put something in my drink. How do I know that? I was drugged. I'm on LCD or something like that. Like I'm on hallucinogens. So LAD and whatnot. So that would be kind of the modern equivalent. So the idea is that, kind of to summarize all of that, the idea is that the skeptic who says that I'm only going to believe what's logical or reason or what's based on reason, and other persons I'm only going to believe what I can see. There are two issues. Number one is that it's self-refuting, because if you say that I'm only going to believe what can be proved by logic, well, that statement you just made cannot be proved by logic, so you can't make that statement. Same thing with the case with the empiricist. And number two, and this is an important thing as well, that epistemology and that approach, if you take that approach, you actually deny so many things that you yourself believe and so many other people believe. So, for instance, if you say, "Oh, I'm only going to believe what I can see," well, you can't see moral values. Do you believe in justice, and do you commit yourself to justice and living fairly? Well, if you do, that can be empirically proven. So, where are you getting that from? You should, disregard that belief as well. So it creates a lot of problems.
So one can say that what makes a fitrah different from these other epistemologies? Can it not be also self-refuting, that you're relying upon something to then say, oh, this is truth? That how do you know fitrah is true? From revelation. How do you know revolution is true? It's from the fitrah.
Okay, very good question. And this kind of gets to the crux of the idea of why the fitrah is kind of the most powerful tool we have to understanding the truth. So it comes down to one decision that everyone needs to make. And the fundamental decision everyone needs to make is there meaning in the world or isn't there meaning in the world? That's the first question. And the Quran presents this dilemma, you can say, to all the human beings as haqq versus batil. And it's interesting, these terms, haqq and batil. Haqq means truth, and it also carries the connotation of purpose, like خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بِالْحَقِّ, created the heavens and the earth with purpose. And it also carries the connotation of rights and responsibilities. Like, that's my haqq over you, or that's their haqq that I need to fulfill. So it's very interesting. Truth from an Islamic perspective is not just theoretical explanations of something that can be logically proven through a particular way. Truth is a very holistic understanding of what is true, which is different from the Western view of truth. And that's an important thing that people need to understand. That when a person says, I'm trying to understand what's true, really what they're trying to say is they're trying to understand what's meaningful. And that's what the Quranic term is for truth. It's what's meaningful. What is purposeful? What is, what is your responsibility in this world? And, what is the truth in general? Those are the terms that are used to describe truth from a Quranic perspective. And so when you see truth in that light and not in the Western kind of conception of truth, because realize the Western conception of truth, you'll never get to truth. And that was the whole point with Immanuel Kant and other Western philosophers. They reached a point where they said, well, we can't really, a pure critique of reason by Immanuel Kant, you can't really, there's an issue here. There's a problem here with trying to prove things based on our way. You can't. There's no real way of understanding truth in any objective way because everything can be doubted. And this is what has led to what we see now in kind of postmodern philosophy, this idea of, okay, if objectively things can't be proven, then let's focus on the subjective. Let's focus on subjectively what people think is true, and that's just true for them. And so from there, you have this, popular cultural cliches of like, you live your truth and, you do what you believe, and everything's very subjective. No one can tell you who you are. No one can tell you your identity. It's about you, et cetera, et cetera. All these different kind of cliches that we hear is stemming from the demolition of any concept of objective knowledge and of any objective meaning in the world. And it comes from the way that the West had conceived of truth. But from the Quranic conception of truth, it's holistic. Haqq isn't just about, theoretical plausibility from logic. Truth is about what's your purpose? What's the purpose? Because when you want to know something, actually, and this is interesting, intuitively, when I say to you that, what is this device, this phone device? When I say, what is it? A person can describe the material and say, well, it's glass and some metallic substances and some complex wiring. They've described, what it is, but they haven't actually told you what it is, right? If someone were if you were to show someone a phone and they said it's some sort of a, glass, casing, and they describe it perfectly, you would say after that, well, you don't know what this is, even though they described the exact material. Why would you say they don't know what it is? Because you didn't actually reveal its purpose. Once the person says, oh, that's a cell phone, in that name carries what makes this a cell phone rather than a glass box is its purpose. It is used to communicate and to do so much more. That is what determines what a thing is. It's its purpose a lot of the time. A chair, what makes a chair is that you sit on it, right? Rather than, oh, it's a wooden substance. Like, you don't really know what it is until you know its purpose. That's the idea of truth. Truth informs a person of purpose. And so obviously the biggest question is, what's the purpose of life? That's part of truth. If you deny that there is a purpose at all, then you've denied the existence of that thing, really. It's not really anything then. In any case, so truth is this kind of holistic conception that the Quran puts forth. And batil is not just, wrong. It's like purposeless, devoid of purpose. It's useless. It's batil. It's totally useless. It's totally purposeless. So that's the decision that human beings need to make at the beginning, which is, do I want to find, is there haqq in the world to search after? Or is this world just batil? That's the kind of two choices that a person has. And when it comes to the idea of, okay, how do you make this choice? So this is where it comes in. This is where the idea of the fitrah comes in. From the fitrah, we know, and this is the case when you look at the data, you look at the studies in psychology, you look at anything, you even understand yourself. Everyone knows that, yes, instinctively, human beings naturally incline towards a view of the world that there's haqq, there's truth in the world, there's meaning to be discovered, and there is a purpose to be fulfilled. That's just the natural way that we view things. And, this is something that's not disputed, even by atheists, that human beings are kind of hardwired to think like this and to search after meaning in life and to believe in God and to believe in things beyond this world and to search after for a purpose. It's an instinct that's there, just like the instinct to, reason about things and to see the world in a logical fashion. Just the same instinct, that the same place where that instinct arises is the same place that this spiritual instinct arises as well. And kind of holistically, that's all the fitrah. So taking all that together, the moral instinct, the intellectual instinct, the spiritual instinct, all that together comprises of what the fitrah is, and it points a person towards that there's truth in this world to be discovered. If you take that, and if you say, okay, I'm going to trust this feeling and this yearning I have in myself, then you are now on the journey towards discovering truth. And if you do that, then you have to search for something that makes sense of this entire world, your life, and everything. You need something to render this world meaningful. And if the world emerged from, just random collisions, it was just randomly arranged in this particular way, then there's no meaning in the world. Because meaning requires intentionality. There had to be a reason why things are the way they are. Then that's where meaning arises from. If there's no reason, then there's no meaning behind it. It's just random. There's no such thing as an explanation because it was randomness. When someone asks, why is it this particular way? There is no real reason. You just say, oh, that's just the way that it was. It was random. And so you deny meaning when you say that the world was arranged just randomly. And so if you say that the world was arranged randomly, you take the batil route. And this is what most consistent atheists will say. Proper atheists who are philosophers will admit there's no meaning in the world. It was all just random. Everything is a figment of our imagination, including our beliefs about our own selves, like our self-identity, that we believe that, Yahya exists, that Astis exists, that Zohair exists, like me as an entity. That's just a figment of our imagination. There's no real meaning behind it. We're just random globs of particles put together. We don't really exist. And subhanAllah, from that, the verse comes to mind, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ. Don't be like those who forgot Allah, they forgot themselves. Because without Allah, without a wise creator that arranged this world the way that it is, there is no meaning that can emerge from it. And so that's the fundamental decision that we need to make. If you say that the world is meaningful, necessarily that means then that this world has a purpose. And when you say that the world has a purpose, then that means that there was someone that created it for a particular purpose. So nested in the idea that there's meaning in the world is a belief in God and a creator. And if you say then that, no, there is no creator, this is random, then you've denied meaning itself. So the fundamental decision a person needs to make is this world meaningful or meaningless? That's the first point that people need to make. And if they say it's meaningful, then khalas, in order to be consistent, then that means that, that there is a reason for their being. There's a reason for the world. There's a reason for the way that things are. That means that there was a non-random way that the world was arranged, and you yourself is a non-random occurrence of this world, et cetera, and all those concepts. Now the question is, okay, fine. I see that that's the kind of two paths you take. So then why do we trust the fitrah? Doesn't that go back to foundationalism in the Munchausen's trilemma? Well, it doesn't, because actually the fitrah is the only option that a person can have in this world when you think about it. Because if you take the meaningless route and you say, oh, this world is just meaningless, and you take that choice, then actually it's self-refuting again. It's self-refuting. Because when you say there's no meaning to this world, then that statement itself, you've just used meaning to deny meaning. You've just used your rational faculties, supposedly, to deny meaning, to deny reason itself, because you're saying, oh, reason is also just evolved randomly. Well, you've used it to make an objective statement, so you can't do that. So it's actually incoherent, it's irrational, it's implausible, it's impotent, it's everything, it's every negative thing under the sun. It's a completely absurd notion to say that. It in itself is a contradictory statement to say there's no meaning in the world, because you've said a statement of meaning. So how could there be no meaning in the world if you've made a statement of meaning to deny that meaning?
What's really interesting is that when we say this concept of meaning and, the truth having some level of meaning to it, one ayah comes to mind, and this was one of the ayah that we mentioned before when we were going through the journey to Islamic thinking, which was when Allah says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. What's really interesting about the ayah is when Allah says that, do they not contemplate on the ayah of Quran, or are their hearts sealed, is that He mentions specifically the heart instead of the intellect, or instead of the mind, or instead of an individual's thoughts. He mentions directly the heart, and the heart being sealed, which ties in really, really well with the fact that actually what is truth, and I mean the whole aspect of truth having some level of meaning to it, and that goes in line with purpose and so on and so forth, which is really, really fascinating.
Very good point. No, that's an excellent ayah that you bring out. The idea that أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. The idea that the heart is the primary epistemological anatomy of the human being, and the heart really refers to, is the seat of a person's way of seeing the world and acting on the world. Because, and this is the main point, you cannot reduce human beings to machines. When you understand the human being from the concept of fitrah, that human beings are composed of this fitrah, like that's what it means to be human being, human nature. And that was the term I had forgotten early on when I was talking about terms to use to explain the fitrah. Human nature is a great term. It's the idea of what does it mean to be a human being? That is what the fitrah is. And so the idea of, okay, where do we find justification to just trust the fitrah? Like I said, it's the only, so we talked about how it doesn't make sense to say that the world is meaningless, because that's contradictory. It's not an option. I mean, if you want to just say that and say, okay, that's the absurdity, then that's then know that that's, number one, it's irrational. It's immoral as well, because you've denied morality completely. Like, it's a complete rejection of every lived experience that you have. Every time you look out the window and see beauty and feel beauty when you look at a sunset, you're suppressing that feeling and that knowledge that you have that this is beautiful, that ideal and that value, because in your head, it doesn't exist. Every single thing that you see in the world of meaning, every meaning that you obtain from someone else speaking language, all of that you have to repress when you say this world is meaningless, which is so interesting, which is why the Quran uses the word kufr in regards to quote unquote disbelief, which I think is not a good, accurate translation of the word kufr. Kufr is repressed. It's repression. It's a repressed belief, because they had that knowledge and understanding, but they repress it. It's repressed knowledge, and they actively repress it. And so that's the idea of trusting. So the fitrah goes away from Munchausen's trilemma, because it's attached to this concept of meaning. That if you make that decision that, okay, I'm going to live my life with meaning, because number one, and this is most people don't think about it in this particular way. At the end of the day, this is, like I said, remember when I talked about how people don't need to study this because people naturally understand this. The average person, they look for responsibility in the world. They look for things to do in the world. They look for ways to be useful. They operate within a particular moral, paradigm. They act in the world as if things matter, as if their life is worth something. Like, all these different concepts are just natural to people. It doesn't need to be explained to them. And so that's what it means to be human beings. Human beings, when they look at the world, they don't see, X's and numbers and mathematical equations. They see a world of meaning. When they see, their parents and family and friends, they don't just see biological entities that are like biological accidents. They see meaning behind that. This is my mother. This is my father. This is my friend. There's meaning that comes from that. And that is something that a person cannot repress. Every single person lives in that particular way. And what is the source of that meaning? Fundamentally, everything will break down unless a person understands and roots this meaning in the existence of Allah. And also as well, a person cannot truly have a human experience unless they're connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because in the connection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the fulfillment of everything a human being seeks. So this fitrah is like a seeking instinct. It's a human being that then seeks after something in this world. They're seeking after that which will fulfill their life. They're seeking after that which will bring value and worth to their life. Every person when they're born, sometimes a person is tested to the point that they have existential questions of, why was I born? Did I deserve to be born? Is my life worth anything? And that question, every human being has to ask themselves. Some people, they're just kind of heedless and they just kind of drown away these questions through life of pleasure. But a lot of people have to ask themselves that question: what's the point? Why am I here? And they search for that answer. It's from the fitrah. And it is only, so the reason why I'm saying this is because it's not, because we're discussing this in a very intellectual, academic way, it's easy to see existence of God as, it's kind of a necessity to meaning, and meaning is kind of the main point. No. It's the complete opposite. We're just saying that because of the way that we're discussing it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the fulfillment of every human need. Antum al-fuqara ila Allah, that's what it says in the Quran. Human beings yearn for things. They yearn for purpose. They yearn for meaning. They yearn for love. They yearn for worth. They want to know that their life is worth something, that the striving and the sacrifice is worth something. They are looking for love and belonging. That's what a human being is. It's not just about logic and some sort of algorithm in our mind. A human being is looking for these things. Embedded in those things are all the things we spoke about. But on a real level, the lived experience of a human being is not kind of what we were talking about. It's this pursuit of happiness, this pursuit of meaning, this pursuit of fulfillment. And that is the pursuit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the source of the fulfillment of our needs. He is Al-Ghani, He is Al-Ali, He is As-Salam, the source of peace and tranquility. And through His names and attributes and His qualities, that is where a human being really is able to be human. They're able to find answers to those questions, and they're able to live their life in accordance with that consequences.
That's a really profound point. And I guess at the other end of the spectrum, before we even actually go to this idea of someone not even having any belief whatsoever, but even within the Muslim sphere of how theology and philosophy actually developed, many Muslims came to the conclusion that sort of following this idea of reformed epistemology, where there is thesis essentially that says that there is a rationality behind religious belief. This really central idea that's been sort of implemented, where there isn't really this need to appeal to evidence or arguments, and you can actually create a premise within itself. I know that we've actually covered most of it.
I'm sorry for rambling.
Your answer was very comprehensive in terms of covering these angles and actually addressing. Yeah, no, it's absolutely fine. But I mean, just to sort of have a little focus on reformed epistemology within itself and how deep it actually goes and some of the consequences it can have. I mean, what would you say to those individuals that do fall on that spectrum and do follow that route of absolute rationality?
So reformed epistemology, according to my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea that religious beliefs do not require rational justification because they emerge from the same, you can say, epistemological level as reason and empiricism, in the sense that what we just talked about, the idea that, so that's the idea of reformed epistemology, which I think is very much in line with kind of what we're saying, which is this idea that you don't need evidence. And actually, you find many quotes from Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, throughout many of his works, and one of his most famous ones, Madarij al-Salikin, as well. He has a section, interestingly, under the section of chivalry and manliness. He talks about the idea of not needing evidence and justification and argument to come to an understanding of truth as a defining feature of masculinity, which is very interesting. So he talks. He says, "Kayfa atlab ad-dalil ala man dalil alayh?" How can I search for a proof for the one who is a proof for my own existence? In the sense, he talks about the idea of how are you going to prove something whose existence is more obvious than the proof itself. This is very much in line with that idea of reformed epistemology, that it doesn't require a justification and evidence. All it requires, belief in Allah, is the decision that a person has to live their life with meaning. That's it. It's really at its root, then it's the decision to live life.
I guess a further question would be with that. when it becomes synonymous with rationality, right? But uh, a lot of individuals and a lot of academics, they make this appeal that, you know, that's fine. Well, let's negate the fitrah. The fitrah has its place, but let's focus on absolute rational thinking. So there is that level of rational thinking that is required in order for you to believe to begin with,
Hmm.
which effectively actually negates the fitrah in the process. So, I mean, how do
Yeah.
we go about actually addressing this issue? Because it seems to be a very big issue within sort of the
Yes.
focus of the theological debates that took place. And even Ibn Taymiyyah himself addresses this many times. But within a contemporary perspective, one of the things that we mentioned before was that, you know, we live in a very, very literal world where everyone has this level of thinking, and to many extents, thinking within
Yeah.
itself is imposed on others. This level of criticalness. So, how do we actually address this? That, you know, negating the fitrah and inclining entirely towards rational thinking.
Very good point. So yeah, you're right in the sense that when people try to prove Islam or prove anything, saying that we're going to take an absolute rationalistic approach, they've in essence kind of, overstepped the fitrah in that sense. But as I mentioned earlier, number one is that recognizing that
Yeah.
if you take that approach, you are on a kind of a doubtful ground because there is no rational proof for your epistemology, so to speak. Like if your goal is, see, it's all about starting out with your goal. Your goal is, I want to make sure all my beliefs are proven rationally. Well, that goal itself, what's the rational proof for that? See, the difference between that and what we're advocating for, which is the idea of a meaningful approach, is that when a person says, hey, I want to, live a life of meaning, and then a person can ask, oh, what's the meaningful justification? Because that isn't, it's not a rational argument. It's just, I'm looking for meaning, full stop. It is able to subsist in and of itself. And then it's like, okay, the fitrah is here and it will bring me what is meaningful. It will provide me what is meaningful. And if you say, oh, well, how do I trust these faculties if they're, true or not? Well, then it goes back to the second point, which is, well, then this world is meaningless because the same faculties you're using to doubt that are the faculties that you are doubting. You're doubting reason with reason, et cetera, et cetera. And in any case, so that's one point to mention, the idea that absolute rationality does not engender true knowledge, because it just engenders doubt, because you can doubt everything, including the first premise. And so everything that emerges from it is just doubtful. Secondly, what I'd say is that, like I said, fitrah and reason are not at the same level. Reason is a part of the fitrah. Like the reason depends on the fitrah for it to be able to be utilized. It depends on this notion that the world is meaningful and that a person wants to seek a meaningful existence. So actually, that reason is subsumed under fitrah, like it's subordinate to the fitrah. And it's something that the Indian thinker Allama Iqbal mentions in Reconstruction of Islamic Thought. He says the idea that under faith is actually subordinate to faith is reason. And people should not confuse the two. Although you can use reason to kind of dig deeper on a different level of, shifting true false beliefs and true beliefs, in the sense that, once a person knows, okay, I want to live a meaningful life, then khalas, their reason is able to be, there's justification, there's ontological grounds and epistemological grounds for a person to use their reason. Why? Well, because the person is looking for a meaningful way of looking at the world, and reason is a way of making meaning about the world. And so there's grounding there, but it requires the first step of that faith, and faith is not just belief in the absence of evidence. It's the first step. It's the only step that you can take. It's that faith really is, this first step of faith is the commitment to living a meaningful life. That's what faith is. And once that's there, then reason can do its job. So it's subordinate under this faith. If the faith is gone, then reason can't be used anymore because it can be challenged. So in terms of, okay, how do we kind of get this attitude? And just to comment on that attitude, it's definitely pervasive and it exists. And it's not just in our times, contemporary times. It's been the case for many centuries. And as early as the Muslims encountered Greek writings, Muslims have had this kind of compulsion and this fascination to try and prove and justify Islamic beliefs and practices through Greek philosophy, through logic and through reasoning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. and it's proved to be a very fruitless effort. Imam Ghazali himself, rahimahullah, he mentioned this point. I mean, before he went on his spiritual journey for truth, he was overcome with doubt, and he talks about this in Manhaj al-Shak. Sorry, he talks about this in Munqadh min al-Dalala, the awakening from misguidance, and he talks about kind of his way, and he talks about the idea that logic or reason-based theology doesn't really bring true certainty. True certainty and yaqeen is a spiritual pursuit, and it's the idea of cleaning up one's heart so that fitrah can shine and bring that sense of certainty into a person's mind. And that kind of just theoretical debates don't really lead to any significant, changes in a person's faith. And so I think recognizing, number one, the problem of taking an absolute rationalistic approach and how it's self-defeating, understanding the idea that faith is actually the most fundamental kind of epistemological level that a person can take, and everything beyond faith and meaning is subordinate to that faith and meaning, that iman in. And when I say faith and meaning, really it's iman in Allah. So those are the things that kind of need to be explained. And the problem is, obviously, as you can see through the course of this podcast, it's very difficult to convey and communicate these ideas. And the reason for that is just quite simply because it's common sense. Common sense is very hard to explain because it's so intuitive and reflexive to us. It's very hard to explain to someone what we've just described, because what we've described is nothing groundbreaking. It's just totally natural. Like, no one needs to be told what is good and bad and that we should live good and bad lives. No one needs to be told, oh, you should fulfill your responsibilities, you shouldn't lie. No one needs to be told that. That's just what everyone lives by. And this is the idea that when you engage in too much philosophical rhetoric and all this stuff, it just leads to all this doubt. And so that's definitely a challenge in regards to communicating kind of what we've done. Now, there's the idea of who do you communicate to? You communicate, obviously, to people who are dealing with doubt and kind of try to engage with them at this level to try and show them that their approach, their epistemology is flawed. And not just flawed, a person might say, oh, you're just cherry picking because this is not getting to belief in God, then you don't like it. No, it's not about that at all. It's that it doesn't get to any truth about anything at all, because you can use that, when you use that epistemology and take it to its logical end, everything becomes doubted because you doubt the source of that knowledge itself. The epistemology is self-refuting. It's self-doubting. The epistemology itself makes that epistemology doubtful. So that's the problem. Demonstrating that is important. But I think for our children, which is very important, for the next generation, how do we raise them up with kind of a fitrah-based approach to life and faith? I think a lot of it is about, showing logic and reason and science, in our culture, which is kind of heralded. It's like the gods and the idols of this age, showing, their limitations and understanding them as tools. And really, at the end of the day, fitrah doesn't need to be taught because it's within all of us. But if it's diseased and it's perturbed, and it's another point, obviously, because the diseasing and the perturbing of the fitrah can occur through non-intellectual means, through bad moral decisions, through bad company, through spiritual darkness. That can also kind of blur a person's fitrah in different ways, and go into that.
So with that in mind, I think a lot of us, especially growing up in the West, we've lived in a very over-sexualized world. We lived in a world where we've been we desensitized to gore and violence, and where news, right, the amount of news that we intake, we're desensitized to so many aspects. And now we're desensitized to philosophical thought. We're on and on and on, right? So how do we take, the fact that many of us might not have, as you said, our fitrah might be blurred. How do we clear it?
That's a very good point. That is through the process of tazkiyat an-nafs, purification of the self, or actualization of the self, to use Western kind of terminology. So this is why Imam al-Ghazali mentioned the idea of the spiritual pursuit, or the way of the Sufis is the way to certainty. Because the idea from an Islamic perspective is that certainty, and actually this is the case even from it, you can make the neurophysiological case for this as well. Certainty, actually, and there's an interesting book called On Being Certain by, the author escapes me again, apologies, but it's called On Being Certain, and it's written by a neurologist, I believe. And he actually describes the idea, it makes the case that certainty is not a property, it's not in accordance with the kind of rational justification or evidentiary justification of an idea. It's an emotional response to a particular idea. So certainty is an emotion, and they show that certainty arises from the limbic areas of the brain, which is associated obviously with the emotional processing aspect of the brain. And one of the most kind of strongest emotional responses come from the limbic system. And so because of that, people have said, okay, certainty actually is more of an emotional response, which is why you have disorders of certainty in certain mental illnesses. So OCD, for instance, obsessive compulsive disorder, is a disorder of certainty. It's rather a disorder of doubt. A person is not able to achieve adequate certainty, that there's this feeling. Oh, by the way, when I said certainty is an emotion, and as well, doubt is also emotion, rather than being, an actual doubt, rather than emerging from, insufficient evidence, is actually an emotional response. And so that's why you have disorders of it. And so, emotional OCD is a disorder of doubt, really, where a person is just completely in doubt of, well, I shouldn't say it's a disorder of doubt. It's not really a disorder of doubt. It's obviously a disorder involving obsessions and behavioral compulsions regarding it. But you can look at it from the perspective of kind of an overactive doubting, where a person cannot achieve any certainty in the most basic things that have all the evidence there. Like, everyone knows evidence. You can even tape record and show these people the most clearest evidence that they lock the door. They will not feel at ease until they go back and check like 4 or 5, 6, 7 times, depending on how debilitating the compulsions are. Washing hands, all these different things. And it even transfers over to areas of wudu and things like that. So this is the idea. Doubt and certainty are kind of these emotional responses. You can also say as well that certainty has a spiritual element to it. And actually, there's a book by Andrew Newberg, and he's the founder of what he terms neurotheology, very fascinating field. He is he's a medical doctor, but I think he's some sort of specialty regarding the brain. I know he's not a neuroradiologist, but he's a medical practitioner. I think he might be an interventional radiologist that deals with the brain. In any case, his academic interest is in regarding essentially measuring brain activity and correlating it with different spiritual experiences of many different faiths. And actually, he studied the Muslim salah and dhikr. And there's a fascinating study you can find where he actually images the brain of a person engaged in salah and compares a person praying with khushu' and a person praying without khushu'. And he shows that, there's actually different levels and areas of activity that occur when a person's concentrating on the salah and areas of submission and whatnot. There's actually a decrease in activity in the frontal areas of the brain, which is associated with planning, executive decisions, et cetera, when a person internalizes the idea of submitting his will to God, that area that's a focus with planning and whatnot is actually decreases in activity, like actually manifesting that submission neurologically in their brain. And obviously there's therapeutic benefits of that because those areas of the brain are hyperactive in anxiety and depression, because obviously a person who's very anxious is very focused on trying to plan things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so engaging in that salah and decreasing that activity is something that's very therapeutic for those people. In any case, what am I getting at from this? When it comes to certainty as well, they've shown that kind of spiritual, knowledge that's achieved through spiritual experiences and actions and behaviors arise from areas of the brain that carry a very strong sense of conviction. And that's why Andrew Newberg said that, from a scientific perspective, we have to take seriously the knowledge that comes from a person's spiritual experiences. I guess where I'm getting at from all this is that the idea that the way when a person's fitrah is obscured or whatnot, and we're kind of drowned in this ghafla, and so we're unable to really operate in the world and live life as it's meant to be lived. And this is what I was getting at earlier, the idea that, when you talk about fitrah, and you can't talk about fitrah from just purely a theoretical perspective, because it's not what the fitrah is. A fitrah merges idea and action, idea and deed together. And that's what iman is in faith. Faith is not just belief. Faith is belief and action together. And so you cannot divorce these two concepts. And so a fitrah is a way of living, and living in this world. And so and that's why. And so a person might ask, well, why is it that when I'm looking at XYZ or doing XYZ, that's going to affect the way I think? It does, because the way you think is determined by how you behave as well. And that goes to the issue, a very famous issue of cognitive dissonance, which a lot of people know about, the idea that your actions can affect your beliefs about the world, if there's dissonance created. So these two things come together. So in any case, when the fitrah is perturbed, when we're kind of living, unspiritually fulfilled lives away from the remembrance of Allah, then our thought is disturbed. We start to think more negatively and more cynically. That skeptic attitude starts to be thrown at things that make our life very destructive. We start to bring that to our relationships. And that's the idea I'm saying. It's not just about philosophical, right? Like, these things carry connotations throughout all aspects of our life. If you act like a skeptic, you're going to be a jerk in your relationships with other people. And if that cynicism comes in from that negativity that you feel, from that pessimism, from your kind of, the sinful life that's being lived, and the misery that comes with that, because that's the idea. The reason why things are made sinful in Islam, are because they're harmful to a person psychologically, physically. And so living a sinful life will bring about very negative psychological consequences. And the research is just full of problems of all the different, vices of this, of the 21st century, whether it's alcohol and intoxication or hypersexuality or whatever it may be. People who live and lead these lives live miserable lives, and that in turn affects the way that they look at the world. It gives them a pessimistic view of the world. It makes them despair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's that kind of emotional doubt about God, et cetera, coming from a place of, being disturbed, really. So the way out of that is spiritual purification. Okay, how do you engage in spiritual purification? That is a whole nother podcast, obviously. But really, it's something that has been looked at and studied throughout Islamic history. There's so many books and guidance available on this aspect of purifying the heart. And really, it's a process of, at its root, number one, muhasaba, taking oneself to account, tawbah, returning to Allah, and for anything that's evil, and adorning oneself with qualities that are beloved to Allah. That's it in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a process behind that, and there's a lot of depth behind that, and there's a lot of inner work that needs to happen, because you're almost doing spiritual surgery to try and kind of understand what's the problem in my soul and take out, the cancer that's affecting the soul. So that's a whole process in and of itself.
I think it's interesting that this wasn't done by purpose, but if you look now back at what we just did for the podcast, it's as if we expounded upon those last few ayat of Surah Al-Imran. The recognizing of meaning, that there wasn't creating a batil.
Yes.
Then to go through what you went through.
Exactly. The end of Surah Al-Imran is so fascinating, and it really summarizes everything we've mentioned in this podcast. And it is the passage that describes like the epistemology of the Quran. As you mentioned earlier, the idea of Subhanaka, Rabbana ma khalaqta hadha batila, the affirmation of meaning in this world, and the disassociation from seeing this world as meaningless. And then before that, Allah describes, well, what is the state, the phenomenological state of that person who arrives at that conclusion? It's not just something that, everyone will arise at. Not everyone will be convinced of that. It's who? The people who الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ, the ones who are thinking about Allah, sitting, standing, and lying down. Now, a person may say, oh, this is circular. Here he believes in Allah. This is the point, that believing in the divine reality is a natural thing that everyone believes in. Everyone believes in the divine, that there's something out there. And people who are searching for purpose and meaning, they are thinking about Allah. That's what they're thinking about when they're searching for something more, when they're thinking about these qualities of transcendence. They're thinking about Al-Ali. That's who is the most transcendent. When they're thinking about qualities of truth, they're thinking about Al-Haq. When they're thinking about qualities of love, they're thinking about Al-Wadud. when they're thinking about qualities of justice, they're thinking about al-muqsit and al-adl. They're thinking about Allah, right? These people. And then they come to that conclusion when they look at the world around them and they bring all that in. Their fitrah outputs what? There's meaning in this world. Not only meaning, by the way, accountability and consequence as well for my actions, which is very interesting because human beings recognize innately. This is why you find cross-culturally this idea that your actions have consequences, whether that's the karma of the of the Hindus, or the concept of nirvana with the Buddhists and all these different things, and obviously the Abrahamic faiths. But beyond that as well, there's a concept of your actions have consequences as well, that you have responsibility in this world, and that there is consequences for those responsibilities. So the person actually affirms two things: meaning and accountability. So he says, رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Right? So save us from the punishment of the hellfire. Recognizing that there's accountability for actions, and also recognizing I've messed up my entire life, right? And then what's really fascinating is, رَبَّنَا إِنَّنَا سَمِعْنَا مُنَادِيًا يُنَادِي لِلْإِيمَانِ, that how do they come to faith? So they have this, I don't like to use the word assumption because people use the word, this is the assumption that you're having that there's meaning in the world. It's not. It's an iman, it's faith. This is what faith is. And it's not an unproved assumption that you take. As I said, it's the only meaningful, and it's the only meaningful, rational, intelligible, it's the only way to live in this world, is with this faith and meaning, because otherwise life loses its meaning. There's no such thing as life at the end of the day then. So, رَبَّنَا إِنَّنَا سَمِعْنَا مُنَادِيًا يُنَادِي لِلْإِيمَانِ. We heard the person calling to faith, فَآمَنَّا. رَبَّنَا إِنَّنَا سَمِعْنَا مُنَادِيًا يُنَادِي لِلْإِيمَانِ آمِنُوا بِرَبِّكُمْ فَآمَنَّا. That we heard this person calling to faith saying, believe in your Lord, in what brings your life purpose. And this idea that Allah the term uses the term that's the fundamental role of Allah in our life, which is Rabb, which is why that's the term that we use in dua. And that's the first term in the Quran after the name Allah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, that He is Rabb and we are Abd. That's the fundamental relationship we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that's described, again, that purpose is then described, that this is what you're here for, to connect with your Rabb. And we believed. There is no need for any evidence or any argument, which the Quran doesn't give that. The entire Quran does not give that kind of logical argument for that. It just merely presents it, that this is the case. This is what you're looking for. And it's addressed to any sincere-hearted individual looking for truth, looking for Allah. The Surah Al Imran is the end of the Surah Al Imran is a beautiful passage that really explains kind of everything we've been talking about.
I think with that, we've gone quite a bit and we don't want to overburden the people. I think that leaves us with some homework as well. So inshallah, we'll continue. There's some more details about this. Inshallah, we'll have Zohair for more podcasts so we can further delve into this. As I think we can clearly tell, it's very important. And with that, I think we should end the podcast.